Hi everyone. So today I wanted to talk about sort of flimsy or soft leather being used as armor in sort of the ancient and medieval period. And specifically I want to give a defense of using this thin, flimsy, soft leather as armor. So first I want to start with some modern evidence. So to give an anecdote, which isn't the best evidence, but I think it demonstrates the point pretty well, is when I was in high school, one of my friends got into a motorcycle accident. And he didn't hit anyone, but he had to do that by swerving away quickly and end up slamming into the pavement. Now, he did end up breaking his arm from this, but you would imagine that skidding across the pavement of the roadway at a very high speed with your arm dragging along that pavement would have removed basically all of the skin off your arm. But, you know, that didn't happen. And most likely, it's not because he has terrifically strong skin. It's not because this road was particularly smooth, and it's not because of his cotton t-shirt. It was because of a leather jacket that he had. And the leather jackets that are sort of worn today are sort of thin, flimsy leather. Admittedly, they're not as soft as, say, a fashion leather jacket. This is a proper protective motorcycle jacket. But it is, again, a protective jacket made of thin leather. And even if you don't believe this particular anecdote, which I assure you is true, I don't think it's really a coincidence that not just the sort of modern motorcycle culture, but there's sort of been a history of these sort of protective, flimsy leather jackets in sort of the modern era. And, if the leather had no protective value, I don't think this would have happened. Now, I agree it's not great protection, so, it won't protect you from most weapons, and it's not, as protective as, boiled, hardened leather, or even just the really thick leather that, even if it's not boiled, is stiff. And it's definitely not as protective as, say, like a gambeson, or even, proper metal armor. But it does have at least some protective value. So I think it's important to recognize this, because when a lot of people talk about the soft leather armor, I think they sort of downplay its protective value a bit too much. Sure, it's not, great protection, but it is still protection. So, if I had the choice between going into battle with, a metal harness or a soft leather harness, sure, I would take the metal every time. Or even if it was a gambeson or a soft leather harness, I would take the gambeson every time. But if I had to pick between a soft leather harness and nothing, I would go with the soft leather harness. So I think it's important to recognize it does have at least that little bit of protective value. But going on to sort of more ancient and medieval periods and evidence we see there, I'm first going to start off with the Tombeau Cuchulainn, which is of course the famous Irish epic. And we have the Cuchulainn Panoply, which is a section of the poem that gives us a very detailed description of the way Cuchulainn, who was an Ulster hero, prepared for battle. It tells us, the weapons he had, the armor he had, and even the order that the armor was put on. And one of the things you notice is the last piece of armor he puts on is a thin leather, or I think it's described as a soft leather apron. And I think that is one of the ways that we can use soft leather as a form of armor, even if it's not strictly for its protective value. Because, of course, Cuchulainn is sort of before the Irish started using chainmail and other pieces of metallic armor. So the entire sort of armor portion of this kit is organic materials. It's, linen gambesons, leather aprons, leather sort of kidney belts, and things like that. Everything is either leather or cloth. So if you do have a gambeson, and you're wearing that as your armor, yes, if you get hit by a sword or an axe or an arrow or whatever weapon it is, the gambeson will protect you. But if you have a large cut through the front of your gambeson needs to either be repaired or, depending on sort of the severity of the cut, just stitched entirely. And even if you do repair it, where you have that stitching instead of just a normal solid layers of cloth, that's going to be weaker. And if you have leather armor, that same problem is going to be amplified. even if it's just a hard, thick leather or a specifically treated boiled leather. Then once you sort of put a hole or a slice through that piece of equipment, it's going to be a lot less effective. Even if it's repaired, it'll still have a weak point now in the armor. So I think that's could be why we see soft leather, and why it's specifically the last thing he puts on, and therefore would be the first thing the enemy faces, is because soft leather is going to be the easiest thing to produce. So making a gambeson isn't terribly hard, but it requires a lot of material, and so it's going to be pretty expensive. And if you have the choice between soft leather and hardened leather, then the hardened leather is going to be more expensive because it has to start off as soft leather and then be treated, or start off as a particularly thicker hide, which is again probably going to be more expensive. So I think in this case what we're seeing is the soft leather is sort of in armor for your armor. Sure, it doesn't have the protective value to you that the other pieces of armor have, but what it's doing is giving you a layer of something that's cheap and disposable. So when you take a cut, if you take a cut, you're not ruining your gambeson or your nice leather cuirass. You have something else that you can just sort of throw away after the battle and not worry about losing. Whereas losing a gambeson or losing a hard leather cuirass is going to be expensive and difficult to repair or replace. This gives you something, cheap and throwawayable to sort of take the hits that would otherwise ruin your armor. So I think that's one purpose that we could use soft leather for. But even if you have certain forms of metallic armor, it still might be worth having a soft leather armor for sort of that same reason. Even if the soft leather isn't a protective equipment for you, it could be protective equipment for your other pieces of equipment. So let's say you are, and I'm going to jump ahead a bit to sort of late antique and early medieval, where we have things like Sutton Hoo and other finds where you have a chainmail garment, and then other very expensive pieces of equipment. So, to use Sutton Hoo as the example, you have, again, a chainmail shirt. You also have these very decorative, belt buckles and other sort of pieces of jewelry that would go as part of this warrior accoutrement. Or even, it's the same thing if you have a very decorative sword scabbard or something like that. Chainmail is very abrasive, so if I have a chainmail shirt on, and then I put on a nice sword belt like at Sutton Hoo that has gilding and a lot of decorative work on the metal parts of the belt, or even if it do just have the belt itself, even if it's a cheap belt, what's going to happen is the sort of abrasive surface made from all the links of the chainmail is going to slowly grind that away. So in expensive items, that item is going to be, if it just has gilding on top, that gilding is going to be worn away pretty quick. The decoration is going to get scratched up, and even if you do have something like just a leather belt, the leather belt might, it's going to take a long time, but is slowly getting worn out just by rubbing against that chainmail as you're moving around. So I think that could be another reason to have, to maintain your soft leather garment along, even when you have something like chainmail that's not going to be broken as easily, is it prevents the chainmail from rubbing up against and slowly destroying your other pieces of equipment, your belts, your sword scabbards, your jewelry. So in that way we can consider the soft leather acting in the same way that a medieval tabard does later as well, in that it sort of keeps the sun from beating on your mail and burning your hand. If you touch if you put your hand on your chest or whatever else might happen, it sort of prevents that chainmail from overheating. So this soft leather could be a form of tabard, but of course it could also just be a normal tabard. A cloth tabard would in this case perform most of the same functions, but again, that soft leather gives you just that little bit more protection, where it's more protection than just a cloth tabard or wearing the gambeson on top of your mail. Because again, even if while it is something that happened wearing your gambeson on top of the mail, then of course the gambeson has that same risk of cutting as if you weren't running mail. So it's sort of better to put that chainmail on top, but you need something to prevent the chainmail from heating in the sun and from preventing other pieces of equipment from getting scratched and damaged. So this soft leather will do all of those things like a tabard does, but still give you just that bit more protection than a tabard will, while still being less expensive, as well as being, you know, more maneuverable, more flexible than having a hardened leather cuirass on top of that. And that's really where I think this soft leather cuirass, or even just soft leather, shall we say, garments, comes into play, and why they're important and why they're sort of period accurate, is even though they're not really armor in the same way that the hardened leather cuirass or that metal armors are, it's more of a protection for your equipment than it is for you. And I think that's a really good explanation for why and how this could have been used, especially given sources like the Ton, where we know it was explicitly used. And it doesn't have to be an armor in the same way that we imagine an armor for it to make sense to ancient and early medieval peoples as armor. So thanks for watching.